Hi, very welcome to all of you joining from almost 30 countries across the world. This is about Afghanistan, Afghan journalists, and the question what we can do to support them in these terrible times. First, let me introduce myself. My name is Hans Laroes. I am chair of the advisory board of ReNEWS and a former editor-in-chief of a public broadcaster, anyways in the Netherlands. I guess a lot of us know what it means to send our reporters, producers, cameramen, photographers, fixers, interpreters to conflict zones and to get them out again in times of crisis. Our colleagues, our friends. And it's tough to say, but sometimes they are dying to tell these important stories. But this, Afghanistan, I guess, is different. It's the devastating collapse of a country. Journalists, everyone, trying to flee the country to save their lives and futures. And only a few were able to get out, traumatized possibly. Many left behind under Taliban rule. But this kind of escape is overshadowed by the fate of the relatives, friends, colleagues who still are there. And think especially about the women and what they are facing there, day in, day out, every day and again. The thing is, there seems to be no hope, not now. Things will not get better for a long time, I'm afraid. Things will possibly get worse. Which poses an important question to us here in our rather privileged lives. What is our responsibility? What can we do to help? ReNEWS is partnering with the Rory Peck Trust, an organization many of you will know well for its outstanding work in supporting freelance journalists in particular. The director of the trust is with us today and our guest. Here is what we are asking you to consider doing. By donating to the Rory Peck Trust, using the link that we provide, you are helping to fund a new and crucial program. The trust will earmark all of our funds, no money held back for administrative cost or whatever, not a penny, not a cent, to provide Dari, Farsi, and Pashtun language mental health support to Afghan journalists. Dr. Anthony Feinstein, professor in the Department of Psychiatry at the University of Toronto and a pioneer in the treatment of trauma and mental health crisis in media, and a guest with whom we'll speak later on the program as well, will be working with the Trust on creating a network of therapists and qualified mental health professionals, as well as helping to develop a broad-based program that can reach a large number of journalists in need. But let me take just a moment to tell you about the donation process. It is very easy, but there are one of two potential tricky bits. You'll find the link in the chat session, and we'll drop it there several times over the next 90 minutes. Please pay attention. This is a bit of a detail, but it's important. You choose your amount. You'll see that it is in British pounds. Please be mindful that if you are making a contribution from your dollar account or your euro account, for example, the donation is calculated in British pounds. $100 is 75 British pounds, 100 euros, 85 British pounds. I repeat, $100, 75 British pounds, 100 euros is 85 pounds. And in case you or your organization is wondering, 1,000 euros is 850 British pounds. On the next screen, you will be asked for your address. If you live outside of the UK, I guess most of us are, be sure to click on Enter Address manually. Well, perhaps it sounds complicated, but it isn't, you'll find out. And you all are fluently speaking the online language, I'm sure. We want to make our meeting here as interactive as we can. First, there is a chat button. That's where we can meet virtually and chat with one another. The chat will also be the place where we here at ReNEWS put important information, such as I said, the link for donating to this fundraising event. If you have questions to our guests, please put them forward in our Q&A area and forget about the polls. You may do so anonymously if you prefer. If you wish to direct your question to one of our guests in particular, please indicate that. So to summarize, there's the chat for the donation link and for comments and talking to each other, and this is the Q&A button for leaving questions. As you probably know, This event on the future of journalism in Afghanistan is generously sponsored by AFP, and we are tremendously grateful, especially to Phil Chetwynd and his team. Phil is the global news director of Agence France Presse, and he will be our host and moderator for the conversation on the future of journalism in Afghanistan. Before handing over to film this again, please donate. With your donation, we will really be making a difference. And no donation is too small, and of course, no donation is too large either. But first, open your eyes for this.
Thank you, Hans, and welcome everybody to this discussion on Afghanistan. Just before we get going, I just want to give you a little brief about how we're going to structure it. We'll start with just a little section just around the events of August 15 and the shock arrival of the Taliban in Kabul. We have to remember most of the 55 journalists killed in Afghanistan over the past 2 decades have been killed by the Taliban. That's the context. AFP, we lost 3 staff. At Tolo, they lost 7 in one attack. Many others have been killed. Then we're going to have a look at what are the different decisions people made at that moment as the Taliban arrived. We shall then move it on to looking at, what is happening now in Afghanistan, how journalism is trying to be done by different organizations. And finally, we'll talk about something we're already seeing in larger and larger numbers, the trauma and mental health crises being experienced by Afghan journalists around the world. So just to get going, let me introduce you to our terrific group of guests. I'm really honored to have Clarissa Ward, Chief International Correspondent of CNN. We've got Mujeeb Khalvatar, the director of NI, an Afghan media NGO and a former radio journalist who's just moved to Canada from Afghanistan. We have Najiba Noori, an AFP video journalist and former filmmaker who's just moved to Paris from Afghanistan. And we've got Lotfullah Najafizada, the director of TOLOnews, Afghanistan's biggest independent media company, who is joining us from Istanbul. Thank you all for being here. I really appreciate it. Clarissa, could I start with you? You were in Kabul on August 15 when the Taliban emerged into the city in a slightly unexpected way. I believe you were there more on a sort of reporting trip ahead of September 11 anniversary and so on. Can you give us an idea of what it felt like at that moment and also the decisions you made as an organization and as a journalist at that moment?
Well, first of all, just thank you so much for having me. And I feel honored to be with such esteemed panelists. It was an incredibly chaotic and frightening moment. No one expected this to happen as quickly as it did, even though it did look like it would happen at some point. No one expected it to happen in a matter of hours. And suddenly you had decisions you had to make. Do you stay in Afghanistan? How is the Taliban going to respond to journalists? How are we going to protect our colleagues who live here in Afghanistan and who are Afghan? How are we going to continue our bureau? Do we stay in the house we're in? Do we move, try to go to the airport? There were about 1,000 questions that every journalistic organization was grappling with in one moment, and having to make decisions that were the best in terms of servicing the people who rely on us for information, but also really importantly, having to make decisions that were in the best interests of the people who have been working with us on the ground, taking the majority of risks here in Afghanistan for 2 decades.
And what was the feeling like on the ground? We've sort of seen pictures of you surrounded by mobs sometimes of Taliban fighters. Did you feel incredibly insecure at that moment? I mean, you've been in a lot of difficult situations, I know. But what was the mood at that point?
I think the mood was one of absolute uncertainty. I had a slight degree of comfort because I had just spent several days with the Taliban in Ghazni province, and I was working with an Afghan filmmaker who's based in the UK, who has good relationships with the Taliban, and we had basically been given assurances that we would be able to continue our work. But I want to make it very clear that a level of privilege that our Afghan colleagues often do not. And we saw that very clearly with the horrendous beating of those two journalists just the other week. And so I can often go out in the streets and stick a camera in someone's face and say, why aren't you doing more about women's rights? That does not mean that it's an indication that the situation is not dangerous, is not chaotic, that journalists are not facing intimidation. That's really just a demonstration of the privilege that I enjoy as a Western woman.
Sure. Lotfullah, you had a slightly different responsibilities on August 15 because you're basically in charge of what would be Afghanistan's most watched TV channel or most watched news program at that point. You must have had real questions about what to do. Your company has been ruthlessly targeted by the Taliban in the past. Was it easy just to stay on air and carry on broadcasting? What decisions were made?
Thank you, Phil. Thank you for doing this. I appreciate it. Um, we were really worried after provincial capitals started falling, and we were planning to move some of our operations to Uzbekistan uh, weeks and months before that. So um, I went to Uzbekistan on the 14th, one day before the fall of Kabul, simply to expedite some of our transition there. And within 24 hours, things fell. And since then, I'm stuck outside the country, from one country to another. On the 15th, we had this fundamental question ahead of us without much time to really think about it, was whether to stay on air or to shut it down. And Tolo has about 700 people. And we produced 18 hours of content just on the news side, but a lot of entertainment programs as well, and soap operas and music. So some of those programmings were stopped immediately, but the channels were not off air. We thought if we stop, it would have been impossible for us to start broadcasting again soon. And then the Taliban showed up at our office, within 24 hours. And since then, I'm sure you would like to discuss it further. We have been receiving instructions, and the Taliban would like to see more concession from media. which is really, really alarming. We still have hundreds of people in Kabul. Uh, Dozens have left, but we still have an operation. As our colleague from CNN said, it's a different world when you're an Afghan journalist compared to being a Western journalist in Afghanistan right now. So the future is uncertain. We don't know, but to me, it looks like it's going to deteriorate day by day.
Thanks, Lotfullah. Najiba, perhaps I could just have a quick word from you. In some ways, you symbolize the sort of post 9/11 Afghan generation. You grew up in Bamiyan, relatively peaceful, moved to quite cosmopolitan Kabul. Your family is Hazara. What did you feel? You had no recollection. You grew up in Iran, so you had no recollection of the time of the Taliban from 20 plus years ago. What did you feel when suddenly the Taliban showed up in the center of Kabul?
On 19th of August, in the morning, as usual, I went to work. But during my way, I could see like huge traffic and every streets of Kabul or crowds and every banks that people were trying to get out their money. So I went to the office and at the AFP, and then in the afternoon when I went back to home, after just 1 hour, I could hear the firing. That then I opened my window to see that what's happening. Then I could see like Taliban are in front of my house and they're walking in the streets of Kabul, and they're just at the police station which was in front of my house. So I was totally shocked and I was scared. And everybody was actually surprised because 15th of August was the day that hour by hour everything was changing in Afghanistan. So I immediately I started calling my friends and my family members to make sure that they are safe and they're staying at home. And then I was like totally confused, as a video journalist. That Taliban are against the journalists. I was just terrified and started to find a way, to leave the country, because at the same time my family was keep calling me to leave the country. Uh, I would say it was the toughest decision that I made in my whole life, to leave my country like this. It's like a dream, what happened to my country in just a few hours, because I personally I never thought the Taliban, would come to Kabul. Okay, that the provinces were failing, like day by day, but we were like waiting and we were expecting that maybe there's a way that, Afghan politician or Afghan government, the Taliban, they would have a negotiation and they, we didn't expect like to the Taliban came and took uh, the country, and our president fled the country. So I left my everything in Kabul. I just could lock my apartment and took those things that were valuable for me, like my camera, like some of my hard drives, to go to the embassy. At the midnight, I left my home. I passed many Taliban checkpoints, and Taliban were just stopping me and asking me that where are you going. I remember that the last checkpoints, which was at the gate of embassy, they stopped me and they were not allowing me. They were like many Taliban standing, and I could see like how much they are angry to see like Afghan woman, especially like Hazara woman, standing in front of them and speaking. They were really angry and they were just keep saying that we will not allow you. So after calling to the embassy, after speaking and speaking, I could get, it was very tough, but I could get uh, to the embassy. I would say
Najiba, a little question really from the audience. Did you just make that decision to leave then, on that moment? It was not something you planned in your mind at all?
well, exactly. I don't want it to leave the country like on that day. Okay, we were like targeting like in last months, but it was a big surprise for everybody, and I was like totally shocked. What should I do right now? You know, because I was. When the Taliban regime in 19s, I was not in Afghanistan. I was just 1 year old. But whatever I saw about that time is like just the videos that they publish, you know, in medias and social medias. So I had no idea, and I was really scared. So that's why I decided to leave the country. No, I don't want it to leave the country, you know,
Sure.
immediately.
Thank you, Najiba. That's a very powerful story. Mujeeb, can you tell us a little bit about your journey out and this journey made by so many Afghan journalists in recent weeks to get out the country?
Thank you for having me here. First of all, just 2 days before the collapse of Kabul, when Taliban was seeking journalists in Baghlan and Pulakhumri house by house, I had a statement that it is not based on what Taliban is claiming. They should stop house seeking for journalists. And then I received a voice of some of the spokesperson of Taliban that you're responsible for what you are saying, which is not true, and we are not seeking anybody anywhere. So you will be responsible when we see you. Just a sound clip like this. And then on Sunday, the 15th, during the early morning, I catch the situation and circumstances a little bit different. Less car, calm Kabul. And then on at 7 in the morning, things changed to be normal. I was at the office at 8, and then at 10:30, then everything changed. Then I received the news that Taliban entered the Kabul from west, and also from east, from Pulicharhi. So actually, the nightmare started from there. When I left the office and I wanted to go home, it took more than 6 hours that I go from Kartese, which is a place in southwest of Kabul, to north west of Kabul, which is Khairkhana. And then, very honestly, when before the Kabul collapse and Taliban took the Herat and Kandahar and other cities, I was asked whether I'm leaving Afghanistan, and my answer was never, ever. Why I was saying this, I thought, may Kabul not collapse this much quick and fast, and there will be something that could help us to breathe. But it wasn't the reality. I was there for a week time from one Sunday, on the Sunday on 15 when Taliban get the control of Kabul, and until next Sunday. I try my best to see if it is possible to live there, but I couldn't find a sign of life and a guarantee of for myself to be alive when I continue to stay here. So I start my journey. the opportunities that I had was to leave whether for Canada or for France. So it took 3 days that we were just behind the gates of Kabul airport and reached to the main gate. And then I put myself into the compound and I start my journey. Now I am in Canada. It was hard. It is hard. I left behind 40 years of my life there and 20 years of the hard work I had done there in Kabul, maybe during the day and night. It was too hard. But sometimes you had to make a decision which is a decision that you ever never thought about. It is the journey I started, and now I am here.
Thank you, Mujeeb. Thank you very much. I'd like to move the conversation on a little bit to talk about reporting Afghanistan now, a couple of months after the fall of the Taliban, the arrival of the Taliban, sorry. They say publicly they want foreign news organizations to stay. They're obviously reaching out to different media, and there's a considerable amount of reporting going on. Clarissa, Lotfullah, I'm interested to hear of your interactions with the Taliban, and what are we to make of their statements on the media? Perhaps I'll start with Lotfullah. Lotfullah, did you catch my question?
Do you want me to go? Yeah, sure. Do you
Yes,
want me to
please.
go
Yes, please. Yeah.
Okay. We have been talking with the Taliban for years, face to face. We were probably talking to the Taliban more than anyone else. And they were taking advantage of free press in Afghanistan at the displeasure of the previous government, sometimes even the international community. But with the change of power, I think the Taliban are acting differently. We talk to them. I talk to them at the highest possible level. Sometimes to discuss a political matter. Sometimes to simply ask them to leave my house, taken by their fighters, or their people affiliated or associated to them, and sometimes to discuss release of a colleague. But also, I think what is more important is the fact that they started with suggesting changes and now to taking it to a whole different level of issuing decrees and instructions. The one that we received just 2 days ago, I think that was pretty alarming. Said nothing against Islam, which is pretty vague. Said they should be called Islamic Emirate, not the Taliban, not a Taliban group, not a Taliban government. Simple as that. They said they should be treated as a legitimate government, and the media should not simply criticize them, to put it simply. So no criticism, no objective reporting, no music, no, and they said something strange, that no content to promote other religions. I don't know where this come from, because that is not happening in Afghanistan. Never happened in the past 20 years, at least. Maybe they're referring to some of the soap operas where you see, an Indian soap opera showing mandir, or a Hollywood movie showing church. I don't know. Maybe we are not allowed to broadcast those. I think these are really concerning because I, they're simply asking that we can broadcast only things that they like. In the provinces, it's even more, I think, serious. They have asked journalists to consult with the local or the provincial head of cultural department about their stories, their story ideas, and then after their approval, they can go and do and file that story.
And how are they following up with you? We saw the publication of these rules. Do they then come to you, call you, pressure you?
I think the environment is as such that the letter is enough, especially in the context that journalists were beaten. Two of my colleagues have been beaten in the past month, and colleagues from other media outlets, particularly Clothilde, the image of two journalists that we cannot get off, from our eyes. I think they. I think we understand what they mean, and apparently they leave very little room for discussions. And I'm afraid there isn't much happening in terms of us trying to convince them to change their mind, or they would like to think differently.
Thanks. Clarissa, out on the ground when you're reporting, doing stories, what's the interaction with the Taliban people on the ground like?
It's changing. I think in the initial days after the collapse of Kabul, there was kind of a jubilant mood. The Taliban were victorious. They world to see their victory and were a little more welcoming. I've noticed now being on the ground, much harder to get access. Everything you have access to is pretty much a no. They will treat you as a Western journalist with, a certain basic level of respect. They are not afraid to intimidate you. So let me give you an example, particularly if you're covering a story they don't want you to cover. Today, we went to a protest. Some of your AFP were there as well this morning. Small group of women holding a couple of signs up, basically demanding the right to be educated. Taliban swept in. Beginning, it wasn't even clear what they were doing because there were so many of them. You actually thought for a second, is it possible they're going to protect the protest because they know Western journalists are here? And then a senior Taliban arrived. He came in, pushed the women aside, ripped up their posters, grabbed their phones. The Taliban began pushing us back, pushing one of your AFP colleagues, Phil, quite forcefully, smacking cameras, burst of a machine gun round to try to clear the area and tried to take our cameras, wanted to see what video we had shot. And then at the end of it, we're suddenly polite again and saying, listen, you'd have to understand this is just because this protest didn't have permission. So you see how quickly they can move from being perfectly cordial and polite to quite vicious and nasty. And for anyone, I've time in conflict zones all around the world, they are very scary. And when you are confronted with them on the ground, it can be very disconcerting, frankly. And so for any journalist, that is troubling, and applications in terms of press freedom, but also more in a more sinister way, as we've just heard, in terms of seeing colleagues get hurt.
At some point, there seemed to have been perhaps some differences between, what was said at the leadership level and what was sort of done on the ground. But the scene you've just described there gives the impression that that was the senior level swooping down, as it were. It wasn't just local Taliban, reacting in a sort of in a hasty way, as it were.
No, it absolutely came from the top, and I would also just say, I can't tell you how many times I've heard from senior Taliban leaders, "Oh, why does the media always concentrate on negative things? Why aren't you doing positive stories? Why aren't you doing stories about how there are no more COVID cases in the hospitals?" Which, is frankly preposterous on many levels, but is a valuable insight into their thinking. And they don't see a vibrant, independent, free press, the likes of which we have seen emerge through, organizations like Tola TV here in Afghanistan over the past couple of decades. They don't see that as a positive. They see the press as being an extension of their propaganda, or that's what they would like it to be. And so, even though I would say the leadership is telling people, for the most part, to take a more gentle touch, at least until the Taliban is more entrenched, perhaps gets international recognition, I think the writing is very clearly on the wall, as you just heard Lotfullah articulate, in terms of what their real vision is for media's role going forward.
And what about the coverage of women? I'm interested on your perspective, and then turn to Lotfullah. Just what it seems we can feel that some of the population is disappearing from our news reports. A question of access. I'm wondering how you see that, Clarissa, just that question of getting access to Afghan women at the moment.
I've been working on a story about this very issue. I mean, listen, the Afghan women, and particularly women here in Kabul, are some of the bravest women I have ever come across in any country I have visited. And we see them engaging in small acts of resistance every single day, extraordinary acts of resistance. I was driving with a woman who is a taxi driver and is a widow with five. She has to keep driving her car to keep her children fed. I don't know how much longer she'll be able to do it. She's already received threats, and it's very clear that things are getting much worse in terms of subjugation of women's rights. And we are at least troubling signs of women slowly but surely being erased from public life. You saw in that beautiful AFP video that you began the presentation with, those images outside every past now. Women's faces being graffitied or defaced or covered over. I think that is a really sort of ominous metaphor for this idea of women slowly but surely, as I said, being erased from public life.
Thanks, Clarissa. Lotfullah, I imagine a fair quantity of your women journalists are among those who have left. Do you still have any working Afghan women journalists out on the streets doing stories?
We do have some female colleagues who come to work and present news and some other social programs, but not as vibrant as they were just 6 weeks ago. But two things I think are quite important for Afghanistan of 2021 to realize as a result of 20 years of investment and hard work. One is, of course, free press, and the fact that there are still hundreds, if not thousands, of journalists throughout the country, actively or sometimes sometimes anonymously, less actively contributing, at least on social media. I think that's such a success story. I think they are continuing their fight for free flow of information, not necessarily which side they're choosing or what kind of ideologies they subscribe to. Second is women empowerment. I think women empowerment is real in this country, and we have, as Chris said, we have. It has been proved by these demonstrations. The president of the country left, fled the country with his generals and national security advisor and all, and then women of the country, middle class and lower, go to the streets and protest. That's the reality of the Afghan women. I think these two standing pillars of pro democracy and pro more civil society activism in the society has to be appreciated.
Thanks, Lotfullah. Najiba, I'm interested in your view on this, scene now from exile. But as a working journalist in Kabul, as a working Afghan female journalist in Kabul, tell us a little bit about the access you would get that maybe other journalists wouldn't get, and the stories we perhaps will struggle to get now.
Well, the access that I could get, especially to the women stories, it was very difficult actually for men to access to them. And Kabul or other provinces, there were some stories that I could go and speak to the women and provinces, but my, male journalists couldn't do it. And during these years that I was working as a video journalist, I would say that we have made, many stories about women, and for now, especially in this period of time, it's a huge important that we have women journalists in Afghanistan. So because the issues, to cover or to report what's the issues in Afghanistan about women and what's going on in now in our country. So Taliban stopped women from their basic rights, getting to education, working outside. There are a lot of women that the skilled women, the women that they have fought for their rights in these 20 years, and now they are just staying home, and some of them they fled their country because they were scared of the Taliban. And I think what we can do now is we need to support women. I know there are women journalists that still they are working, and they are the brave women. And what we should do is to support these women, and to continue their work even from far away. We have to support these women. We have to work all together and to raise, to work on women issues right now.
Thanks, Najiba. Thanks. And that's an interesting segue, because it takes us on to sort of the next part of the discussion. Really, is what concretely we can do now to support journalism in Afghanistan. Mujeeb, is that culture of journalism strongly enough embedded? The culture of freedom of speech, the culture of freedom of the press, is it strongly enough embedded? We've talked about the power of social media. Is that strong enough to survive this Taliban onslaught in that sense?
When we are having news from Afghanistan, from the reality of Afghanistan, it means that this is the practical culture of freedom of expression there in Afghanistan. What Taliban is doing, then next day we are witnessing it. We are having it in the other part of the world. It means that, as Lotfullah said, it is the change of the recent 2 decades. So including the women protests that no one even ever thought about, that when Taliban is in power in Afghanistan, then we have women that they are protesting on the streets. So I think we have the culture of freedom of expression, and we have the culture of free journalism among our journalists and among our media community in Afghanistan. That's why we have the situation broadcast here in the other part of the world, and we are witnessing it and we are watching it. Of course, it is the braveness of our journalists here. It is the culture that started 20 years ago to be alive, and now it is alive. And it is the power of I think, free media.
The culture can survive, but what about the business? I imagine your business, the media business in Afghanistan has fallen off a cliff.
Yes, I think the economy is crumbling. I think look at what people are going through. I think that affects the advertising market, and that affects the independent media outlets. I think we have no strong hope for economic survivability of media in the next few months. I think that's probably something that the international community, as well as journalists who have now chosen to live abroad, should think about. How can we save Afghan journalism? Because it would be pity to lose it like this. Look at the capacity, look at the talent, and look at so much achievements made by this industry in the past 2 decades. So I think it's really dependent on the economy, the market economy, which we believe is not doing well right now. And in the meantime, it creates more room for some of the regional powers, as well as black economy and black money, to play a role, and that will further damage credible journalism.
And Clarissa, what about the international media? Do we fear that when Afghanistan stops being the big story, as it is at the moment, what role should the international media play in ensuring that it stays on the agenda?
I firmly believe that we have a real responsibility as international journalists to keep telling the story, to use the position of privilege that we do have to push people in power, to hold them accountable. We've seen the Taliban talk the talk, and we need to make sure that we are around long enough to ensure that they walk the walk. And if they're not going to, then that needs to be part of the story too, because I think you touch on a really important point, which is that often the way the news cycle works, when the world's attention moves elsewhere, that's when an oppressive regime, or it could be a corrupt dictatorship, whatever it might be, will take that moment to engage in nefarious activity because they know that the world is elsewhere. So I very much hope that we all continue, and I know AFP plans to continue, as does CNN. It is challenging. No one's going to pretend it's not. The security situation is challenging. The liquidity crisis, trying to get money into the country to pay salaries, to pay bills, to pay drivers and fixers. It's all complicated. It's all challenging. It requires a level of commitment, but it's a commitment I really believe we all need to make.
And do you think post the withdrawal of US troops that the American audience can still engage with this subject?
I think there are certain key issues that Americans are definitely engaged with. Lotfullah brought them up, particularly the issue of women's rights. That's something that Americans care deeply about. And so I do think there will be continued interest in this. And listen, I've always been of the school of thought as a journalist when people would tell me, oh, Americans aren't interested in foreign news, or Americans are interested in a good story, a good character, a fascinating insight into a world, which is full of people who are human and who are brave, and who anyone around the world, even if they've never visited Afghanistan, can connect with. So it's up to us to go the extra mile and find those great characters and those great stories that can make something happening across the world feel vivid and real, and allow people to feel that sense of connection and empathy to ensure that Afghanistan stays in the news.
Thanks. And Najiba, what about this growing community, I suppose, of Afghan journalistic talent abroad? I'm looking at you and Najiba at the moment, but there are many other colleagues gathering in different cities all over the world. Have you thought about how you can contribute, or how this diaspora could contribute to journalism under the Taliban as we go forward?
Well, when these Afghan women start protesting in the streets, that day, when I woke up and saw these videos, I really feel, like regret and like somehow guilty why I left my country. I wish I was alongside this woman and chanting, that we never give up and will fight for our rights. So, but still, I think we can, even from far away, if even we are not inside the country, we can continue our work from here. We can, work with those journalists that they're still in Afghanistan and they're working and they're telling the stories, especially stories of women. So right now I am working with Afghan woman that she's, like making a story and she is trying to get materials from Kabul, and I'm trying here how we can do. I think it's very important that we keep our contact and we keep our networks actively, and we need to now. This is the time that we work together. Whatever we can do from here and they can do from there, we collect these stories and we need to document these stories. This is very important, and we are all working together. As I said, I am helping those women there, that how we can publish those stories that they are working, and out of the countries and the international medias. What we need is now is support. We need support. Taliban, they don't believe in freedom of media or Afghan women. So I think this is now our responsibility, especially those are outside Afghanistan. We need to keep these networks and work all together.
Thanks, Najiba. And we're nearly, it's gone incredibly quickly, this discussion. There's so much more to say, but just as we near the end of it, I've just got a question from the audience, probably best to Lotfullah. The question here is, the Taliban spokespeople seem more accessible, they seem media savvy, or more media savvy than in the past. Is this a blessing or a curse?
I think they're media friendly when the story is about them, and then they favor that story. I don't think that they are media friendly when it comes to serious stories. Look at what happened with Mullah Baradar and the Haqqani group. People didn't know what actually happened in the palace for days, if not weeks. So I wouldn't simply agree to that simplification. Yes, they definitely benefited from the environment that was in Afghanistan in the past 20 years, particularly when it comes to free media. Yes, they definitely benefited from social media. Yes, they were given this platform opportunity on different platforms. But the real, I think, intentions is being tested now.
Thanks very much, Lotfullah. And thank you very much to Clarissa, to Najiba, and to Lotfullah, who I think have to leave us now. We've really appreciated your insights. There's been some great feedback in the chat, so thank you very much for joining us. Great. We're just moving on now to the last section of our discussion, and just a reminder to look in the chat to see how you can contribute and donate to this fundraiser. I'd like to introduce our next guest. Mujeeb is staying with us from our last discussion. We're delighted to have Dr. Anthony Feinstein, who I think is really one of the foremost experts on journalism and PTSD, has worked with many international media companies, including us, and Clothilde Redfern, the director of the Rory Peck Trust, which does an amazing job supporting freelancers, freelance journalists around the world, especially in difficult locations. Welcome, thank you for joining us. I think I'm handing over here to Anthony, who's going to give us a little bit of a presentation just of looking at the state of the mental health crisis for the journalism industry in Afghanistan. Anthony.
Good. So thank you, Phil. I welcome this opportunity, and I would like to share some data from a study that we completed recently. If I could have my first slide, please. So over the last 20 years, my group at the University of Toronto has done a number of studies looking at journalists in conflict and crisis. We started with the Balkans and went on to the Iraq War in 2003, and Mexico with the drug wars, the Al-Shabaab attack in Kenya, the civil war in Syria, the plight of journalists in Iran, and more recently the refugee crisis in Europe. And I put the slide up to show that my research group has a long history of doing this work. We have the expertise and the know-how to undertake research like this. Next slide, please. Which brings me on to Afghanistan. We published a paper in 2018 in the Journal of Aggression, Conflict and Peace Research. Just a call out to my PhD student, Jonas Osmond, but also a big thank you to Mujeeb. This research could not have been done without Mujeeb. I met him at a meeting in Norway. He became a valuable collaborator with this research. He opened doors to Afghan media for me. He made the right kind of contacts, and through his good offices, we were able to take a detailed study looking at the psychological state of Afghan journalists. Next slide, please. The year that we published the study, started the work in 2018, you see data here from the Committee to Protect Journalists showing that Afghanistan was the most dangerous country for journalists worldwide. The most journalists who were killed that year were in Afghanistan, including this wonderful photographer who worked for AFP, Shah Mirar, who was a father of 6 children, and you see him with 5 of his children over there. The loss is incalculable when people like this are killed. Next slide, please. So the study aims were to quantify exposure to traumatic events, to assess perceptions of organizational support amongst journalists. We wanted to look at rates of post-traumatic stress disorder and depression in Afghan journalists, and then to gauge the utilization of mental health resources and the effectiveness of these treatments for Afghan journalists who needed them. The data were collected in Dari and Pashto. Through Mujeeb's good offices, we had access to 5 major Afghan news organizations. Over 100 journalists took part. Got the names of over 100 journalists with a pretty good acceptance rate, about 70%. We collected basic demographic data. We looked at the trauma history of these journalists who had been wounded, colleagues killed, family members killed, and then we did an assessment of post-traumatic stress disorder and depression. The next slide, please. What you can see here is that this was a young group of individuals. Their mean age was 32 years. Majority were male, 3/4. Very well educated. 90% had been to university. And now we get into the trauma data, which really are quite chilling. Over 1/3 of our sample had in fact been injured in the line of work. Almost 3/4 had a colleague who had been killed. 1/3 had a family member who had been killed. I mean, these are extraordinarily high rates of trauma. When we asked the journalists to rate their organizational support on a very simple analog scale, 0 being no support, 10 being wonderful support, the mean number here was 2. So journalists weren't feeling particularly supported by the news organizations despite doing this very difficult work. Next slide, please. Coming to their mental health, we estimated that the rates of post-traumatic stress disorder in our sample was 75%. To put this into perspective, when we did our first study in the Balkans, going back 20 years, Western journalists covering the civil wars in the Balkans, we were able to show a lifetime prevalence rate. So this is a cumulative rate of PTSD of 25%. So these Western journalists have been working for 15, 20 years in zones of conflict. When we added up the cumulative effect over that period, we came to a rate of 25%. When we look at the Afghan data now, This is different. This is a point prevalence. This is a snapshot of a moment in time. And we're getting a 75% rate of PTSD, 3 times what we saw in previous samples. Also, a very high rate of depression, 61%. And what doesn't show up here is that PTSD and depression often occur in the same person. They are comorbid. So very strong association between these two mental illnesses. Unfortunately, only 25% of the Afghan journalists had received psychological treatment. And when we looked at differences between those who had received treatment and those who had not, we in fact found none. So although this group was receiving therapy for their mental health, it wasn't showing up in an improvement in their mental health. And this is perhaps not surprising because the World Health Organization came out with a study a few years back showing that mental health services in Afghanistan were really quite poorly developed and the quality of mental health wasn't good. And so we start seeing this in data like this. So the next slide, please. So what can we conclude from this study? Well, Afghan journalists have been exposed to extraordinarily high rates of violence. As a consequence of this, you're seeing a lot of post-traumatic stress disorder and depression in Afghan journalists, a very high rate. Indeed, when I look at my research over the past 20 years, I've not seen such high rates of trauma in a group of journalists. That the majority of these journalists were not receiving therapy, that therapy, when provided, had not been particularly effective. But it's important to remember that these data predate the collapse of the Afghan government this year. So, with the flight of refugees, the traumatic collapse of what society was like, we now add another layer of trauma to an already deeply traumatized group of individuals. And of course, my data doesn't capture the psychological well-being of Afghan journalists who are now in the diaspora, who have fled their country. So being a behavioral scientist, my data is driven by numbers, and I've shared some of those numbers to you, but I was so moved and worried by the Afghan data that I wanted to try and show it in a different way. And so I made a short documentary, which was completed this year, on Afghan journalists and their trauma. Unfortunately, I could not release the documentary because it would compromise the safety of those Afghan journalists left behind. But Mujeeb was part of the documentary, and I'd like to show you just 2 clips from the documentary that illustrate 2 things. One, the tremendous loss of expertise and just the loss of journalism culture with the collapse of the government and so many journalists leaving. And the second point, which is close to the work that I do, is the terrible trauma that has been suffered by Afghan journalists. So if you could run this short clip for me, please.
I'm executive director for an organization called NAI. NAI means traditional pen, and also NAI means a musical instruments, the flute. The very traditional name of flute in Afghanistan is NAI. So NAI is a media organization working in 3 different but interrelated activities. We are training journalists. We are providing advocacy and also legal consultancy for journalists. And we are doing research on media with almost 100 staff with 5 offices across the country. From 2001 up to now, we lost 109 journalists and media workers. We have been witnessing of more than 1,350 violence cases against journalists. Only in 2018, 12 media houses have been exploded or targeted by rockets and RPGs by Taliban and ISIS. We have different enemies. Since 1978, we lost 2 million people in Afghanistan through the different revolutions and different processes, by Russian army, by resistances, by this or that Taliban. 2 million people have been killed, and more than 7 million just escaped from the country. It is hard in Afghanistan to live. I lost family members, yeah. I lost my father and my son together. And I lost the 18 members of my family just in 2 minutes. Uncles, grandfathers, grandma, and others, aunts. These are the pains that I received from my life. How we can escape from this kind of pain, it's not possible, I believe.
It's kind of hard to follow up after those astonishingly powerful words from Mujeeb in the film. Following up on what Mujeeb was saying and on the statistics that you've laid out, Anthony, in your report, it does feel overwhelming. It does feel overwhelming. 75% of Afghan journalists suffering from PTSD. Is there a way out of this? Is there a way forward from this?
Certainly the task is a very big one, but I do believe that we can't just sit around and do nothing. What you never saw with this documentary that couldn't be released is some of the accounts of the other journalists who've been injured and hurt, and the difficulties that they're battling with in their day-to-day lives, with the psychological scars that come from their work. So I believe that we need to start somewhere. The need is great, the numbers are many, but focused mental health intervention can bring about a significant improvement in people's quality of life. We are not going to be able to provide psychotherapy to a nation. You can't get engaged in lengthy, detailed psychotherapies for individuals with deep traumatic scars. That's a lengthy process, and we're not going to have resources for something like that. But there is, mental health 101. What are good psychological practices? What can psychoeducation do? How can you mitigate the effects of anxiety? How can you do some simple things in your day-to-day life that can improve your mental well-being? And I believe that we have the ability to do that. We can do it in group sessions if necessary, but we can reach a number of individuals if we have some basic financial resources. So yes, you're quite right in flagging the magnitude of the task, but I don't want to start off feeling defeated. I think there are some really positive things that can be done at this point, notwithstanding the challenges.
Mujeeb, I know you were working with Anthony before the Taliban takeover to try to bring mental health resources into Afghanistan to help journalists, to try to develop this. Is that all gone now? Is that all dead now, that work, or can some of it be saved?
First of all, what we wanted to do is to start this discourse that if we are talking about mental health, it doesn't mean that the ability of a person or a group of people like journalists is going under the question. It is a social issue that we have to talk about and we have to tackle. The numbers that says in the percentage, it is before the collapse of the government. I don't know what's going on now. Of course, it has increased, whether by close to the 100% or around this percentage. But let's be very precise that it was before the collapse of the government and it increased now. So what we wanted to do is not something that it is dead now. I'm sure it is possible to continue it. We have to do something for the issues and problems that it is increasingly raises day by day. So possible to use the technology, possible to use the facilities, online facilities, and go forward. It is not dead.
Anthony, thanks, Mujeeb. Anthony, I imagine there's a particular new trauma associated with exile and everything that's left behind and the struggles people feel from having made that decision to leave in that way?
Yeah, I think it's hard to fathom what people like Mujeeb have gone through. To leave your country under these circumstances, to leave so much behind, a lifetime of work. I mean, he's given eloquent voice to the enormous upheaval in someone's life under circumstances like these. And so there's going to be a need in the Afghan diaspora, journalists who've left, for assistance, for help as well. Mujeeb has mentioned those left behind. Absolutely, the need is great over there, and it can be a challenge to get psychological resources to people like that. But there is now the new issue of what's the emotional well-being, what's the emotional state of journalists who fled the country, who've left behind everything, who have left the country under the most traumatic and difficult of circumstances, things that they hadn't planned for. The sudden collapse has thrown their lives into chaos. Not only their lives, but the lives of family members and children as well. So yes, you're quite right, Phil. There's going to be a need within the Afghan diaspora, journalists in the diaspora. How can they be helped as well? And they have to enter the equation.
An interesting question here posed by Hannah Storm. Are there other things we should be doing as a community to help Afghan journalists suffering from trauma beyond just therapy? Are there other issues, other things we should be doing, Anthony?
Well, therapy is just one part of the equation. I think societies need to help immigrants integrate. They need to try and make this very difficult passage less difficult. So, the social network that you build up around yourself through connections, through friends, engaging in the civil society around you becomes very important in trying to lessen the alienation that people feel with the forced migration like this. So, you don't want to put all your eggs in one basket in terms of let's just give therapy and things are going to be fine. There needs to be attempts made to help people engage in the new ways of life. There's a limit to what psychiatry or psychology is going to be able to do in situations like this, but to broaden the interventions, I think, is going to be very important. You do not want to just keep your blinkers on and say therapy will take care of everything, because it will not. I mean, therapy can give people certain basic mental health skills which are essential, but there is going to be the broader question of helping individuals integrate into a new world and helping them come to terms with change that has come about so suddenly and so traumatically. And that's going to be a very important variable in this as well.
And Mujeeb, I'm just wondering, are there specific cultural issues around therapy in Afghanistan, or in Afghan society? Is it difficult sometimes to present this as a solution? Is this something that is accepted, or is it very new?
As I said at the beginning, that what we wanted to do to start the discourse, it means that I'm talking about my community in Afghanistan, about the Afghan people and Afghan culture. So when you are talking about mental issues, so it is very hard to distinguish being or having a mental issues or being mad or crazy. Or it is very hard to convince people that when there is mental issues, it is possible to be treated. It is not madness. It is not craziness. It is just an illness that our physics sometimes receives the same thing our what we call it, we are facing with mental things too. I think still it is a taboo in general in the society, but with those people that we have started to talk about, somehow it was not a big group of people even among journalists, but some of them convinced to talk, to give the information, to give the past and the background. It means it is possible to talk with the people, and it is possible that they could accept this as an issue rather than a taboo to not discuss about.
Thanks, Mujeeb. And Clothilde, maybe I could come to you and just talk a little bit about some of the support that the Rory Peck Trust is trying to bring to Afghan journalists who are, who have come out of Afghanistan, and also the program we're trying to put in place here. Can you sort of tell us something that would lift the spirits a bit, and how we think we could move forward from this, really, really difficult situation at the moment?
Well, I can tell you already that you've done a really wonderful job hosting this discussion and encouraging people who care about this issue to come together and learn about it and donate. So my colleagues have just sent me an update that we've already received 14 donations for the Trauma Fund, raising over £1,000. So that's really fantastic. And obviously every little bit helps. The Rory Peck Trust has been providing subsistence grants, what we call subsistence grants, for 25 years. Now, these tend to cover basic financial needs, house security and food security, literally paying for a roof over your head, giving you a couple of months' wages so you don't need to worry about money while you're sort of getting your life back on track. When the crisis happened in Afghanistan, the Rory Peck Trust itself didn't have any logistical support on the ground. So we ourselves weren't able to get anybody out, but we were able to help coordinate efforts of the Journalists in Distress network. So this is a network of 23 international media freedom organizations that all provide assistance to journalists, some with all sorts of different resources available to them. And what we do is we coordinate together. The Rory Peck Trust sits on the steering committee for this network, along with the Committee to Protect Journalists and Free Press Unlimited. And we work together to ensure that we can coordinate resources so that as a community, we can help the largest number of journalists. Because as Najiba said so eloquently, what is needed now is for Afghan journalists who have been forced to flee to be able to recover so that they can return to work and pursue their vocation and their purpose as journalists and support their counterparts who have chosen to or cannot leave in country to continue to tell the truth of what is happening in Afghanistan. So that's how we've been helping. And I know that at the moment, the JID is in the process of mapping the needs of all the journalists that they've managed to help out of the country. So between the members of the JID, 91 journalists were helped to escape. And now the job is going to be how to help them to rebuild their lives and rebuild their careers and give them an opportunity to continue their vocations as journalists. I mean, I feel such sympathy for Mujeeb and Nabija, who have had to leave entire lives and careers that they've spent years to build, and to Lotfullah for staying the course and trying to keep TOLOnews going, to keep his audience informed, despite the Taliban's increasing constraints. I mean, that must be a very hard choice to continue despite all those restrictions he's under.
Thanks, Clothilde. And maybe you could just tell us a little bit about the journalist mental health program.
Yes, so
funds are going to support.
We have actually seen an increasing amount of requests to our as general assistance fund asking for help to pay for trauma therapy. This is from journalists around the world. Though, as we've seen from Anthony's presentation, he paints a very sobering picture of the really, really high rates of trauma that Afghan journalists have been exposed to and the huge need for mental health there. We've known that there's been a mental health crisis in journalism for a couple of years, and I've worked really hard to try and address the issue. But as Anthony will know, it's incredibly hard to fundraise for. So again, I'm really pleased you've put this event together to do just that. We launched a resilience program under which this designated trauma fund for journalists will sit. And any funds raised through this event will go directly to the trauma fund for Afghan journalists, and every single penny will go to pay for trauma therapy for Afghan journalists.
Terrific, thank you, Mujeeb. Thank you, Clothilde. If I could, Anthony, one last point. I've always been very struck in your presentations to media companies about therapy. and how resilient the human brain is and how resilient human beings are. So, give us an upbeat assessment too. We can get back from some of this crisis, right?
Absolutely. I think therapy makes a difference, and good journalism depends on healthy journalists. So we know the data show that therapy helps. We're going to have to be very sensitive in tailoring the therapy to the needs and the culture of Afghan journalists. I'm so pleased you raised the question of culture, Phil, that we have to be extraordinarily sensitive to the culture of people whom we're trying to help. And that's why having Afghan partners in a venture like this is absolutely essential. We will take guidance and look to them for assistance, and they can help point the way for us on many issues. But yes, therapy makes a difference. We can help people, and we mustn't lose sight of the fact that if people they want to rebuild their lives, mental health can bring you down very hard indeed. PTSD and depression are not abstract conditions. They come with a very real morbidity. They blanket a person's life. They affect family members, etc. But therapy can change all that. Therapy can make a very real difference. And so you're right, we should end up on an optimistic note amidst all this gloom. We're getting together here, we're having a fundraiser, we're focusing on an issue that hasn't been discussed to any great length in Afghanistan. The very fact that we're doing it now is evidence of positive change, and we need to build on this. So, I'm cautiously optimistic with the right people, we can make some differences, positive differences.
Terrific. Thank you very much, Anthony. It's a very eloquent way to end the discussion. I'd like to thank all the guests for their participation. Thank you very much. It's been a terrific discussion. We could go on for another hour or so. The only regret is that we have to wrap it up now. But I shall therefore go back to Hans for a final few words on our program today. But thank you all for your participation, and thank you everyone for listening. And please, if you can, make a little donation for us. Thanks very much. Bye-bye.
Thank you, Phil. And there is a way to keep on talking about this. I'll explain in a minute. We have a possibility for speed dating networking. But first, my thanks is to our impressive speakers. I can only imagine the pain some of them must be carrying and their perseverance, which I think is admirable. And the idea to create a strong cooperation between journalists in the diaspora and their colleagues still in Afghanistan is important. It's a way to change things and to help everyone this side of the border and in Afghanistan to move on with their lives. It's not the right expression, but to do something. And even important, we here, as I said, in our privileged positions, we can do all kind of things. Not turning our backs when the big story on the Taliban takeover disappears. It all explains, I guess, why we are here, and I am humbly asking you again to donate and help support this important initiative. The link to donate will be active until October 8. And please, it is important when you're outside of the UK, enter address manually, then it works. Many thanks to Anthony Feinstein, who came up with this plan and who helped us to remind that if we can help just one person, it is worth it. And we are aiming for more, of course. Thanks to AFP and Phil for a tremendous important conversation and for taking care of all costs. It means we can spend every cent on this project. We will be absolutely transparent through our website on what we will do with the money. Thanks also to CNN and the Impact Your World team for advising us on fundraising. Thanks, of course, to the ReNEWS team behind our screens. And special thanks to all of you for joining us and supporting this initiative. Just so you know, the recording of this session will be available on our YouTube channel. And as I said, let's go on speed dating, be in touch a little bit longer. At the left side of the screen, you will find the networking button. Just use it and you will meet, just for a couple of minutes, very interesting and very kind people, your peers. From me, just this. Please keep on following what we do at ReNEWS. Stay a while for networking. Stay connected to this cause. Stay healthy and stay safe. Many, many thanks. Have a great day.